everybody. A very warm welcome to the webinar this afternoon. As usual, people have signed up from all over the world. So wherever you are, it's very nice to meet you virtually. I'm sorry I can't actually see you all in front of me. Well, those of you who are regular attenders of the IHF webinars will know that our recent webinars and forthcoming webinars have been linked so far as possible to the great exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum on Epic Iran. And this, as you will know, has been co-organized by IHF and the Victoria and Albert Museum in association with the Sarikani Foundation. The last webinar that we organized was on Zoroastrianism, and the next one will be on contemporary art in Iran. The contemporary art webinar was actually scheduled for August, but it's been necessary to postpone it until September. But it will be before the end of the exhibition. After that, in October, Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones from the University of Cardiff will be talking to us about the Persian Empire. Well, this afternoon, we've got a very interesting program. Today's webinar is entitled Continuity and Creativity in Persian Poetry. And two very distinguished scholars will be in conversation with each other. We're very honored to have them with us this afternoon. One is Professor Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak. He's Professor of Persian at the University of California, Los Angeles, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. And he's also the founding director of the Roshan Center for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland. He's written and edited a large number of books and articles, and he's known all over the world for his contributions to Persian poetry. And he's currently working towards writing a history of Persian poetry. And I'm happy to be able to say that this project has received some funding from our sister organization in America, IHF America. And some of us, at least here in the UK, had the pleasure of meeting Ahmad and getting to know him when he was based here for a short while, a year or so, I think, at SOAS. And there was some thought at that moment that his great history of Persian poetry might actually be written under the auspices of SOAS. But unfortunately, for those of us here in London, he was whisked away to California, where he now is. So today, Ahmed is going to be in conversation with Narguess Farzad, who I think will be well known to nearly all of you, because of course she's participated in a number of IHF programs in the past, and including some quite recent ones. And she's the senior lecturer in Persian Studies and the chair of the Center for Iranian Studies and the Kamran Jam Scholarship Committee at the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that Narguess is the chair of the IHF subcommittee, which is responsible for Persian Language Online, which, as you all know, is a free language learning website, which now is owned and managed by the Iran Heritage Foundation. It came under the wing of the Iran Heritage Foundation just a couple of years ago, and I have to say that everybody in IHF is absolutely delighted with this tie-up. Lastly, I might say that in addition to being involved with the Iran Heritage Foundation, Narguess also has important roles with the British Institute of Persian Studies and the Iran Society. With regard to this afternoon's event, it's been organized as usual by Astrid Johansson. You won't see her, I think, but it'll be her managing the PowerPoint. The other point that I should make is that I'm sure you'll have questions and comments as the event proceeds. So please type these into the Q&A box as usual. Don't wait until the end of the event before doing that, because they'll be monitored by the participants as we go along. The last point I'd like to make is to remind you that this event is of course free, but all contributions to Iran Heritage Foundation would be gratefully received. And you can find out about how to make contributions by going to our website. So I think that's now enough from me. Without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Narguess. Narguess, please.
Hi, good evening, John, Professor Curtis. Thank you so much for those lovely comments about me, and certainly the most inadequate comments about our guest speaker, Professor Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak. And of course, good morning to our viewers in United States and Canada, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening to Iran and further east. We often start such occasions by going through the ritual of saying it is an honor, it is a privilege, but I really want to pause and focus all your attentions to say that it is truly a privilege to be somehow to have been allowed to gate crash this evening and act as the chair for this conversation, for this amazing occasion, to sit at the feet of Professor Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak and learn just a drop from the ocean, that it is the wealth of his scholarship, his knowledge, his reflection on Persian studies, and of course, particularly on Persian literature, Persian poetry. Again, the usual platitudes are that, you know, we say that the speaker needs no introduction. Well, for the audience tonight, I jolly well hope that it needs no introduction, because if you work on Persian literature, if you work on Persian language, if you're interested in it, if you are studying it, then I have no doubt that you would have referred to, you would have devoured, you would have learned from a host of tremendously significant publications penned by Professor Hakkak, and you may even have been lucky to have sat in many of his classes. The book that appears on top of every student and scholar's reading list is Recasting Persian Poetry, Scenarios of Poetic Modernity in Iran, for many students who are interested in modernist study of Persian literature. And as I said, this is one of perhaps about 22 books. I was one of the very lucky people who was able to benefit from the presence of Professor Hakkak when he was invited to SOAS as the Leverhulme visiting professor at SOAS University of London. And I learned one very important fact from him. He may not even be aware that somehow, by osmosis perhaps, he passed this courage to me. That I remember Professor Hakkak talking about, getting rather exasperated that about all these modern theoretical study of literature, all the disciplinary, multidisciplinary study. And he sort of almost said, you know, be brave enough to just rely on the poem. Just how about transdisciplinary, go above disciplinary? And I am indebted to him for so much else as well as this one invaluable advice. Tonight, Professor Hakkak have very kindly agreed to talk to us about something which I think has been part of your research and scholarship for quite a while, looking at continuity and creativity in Persian poetry. And I think we chose the Persian of تداوم و خلاقیت در شعر فارسی. So I'm very aware that you're not here to listen to me, but to Professor Ahmad Karimi-Hakkak. So may I invite you, Ahmad John, to please give your presentations, and we are delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much, Narguess John. Thank you, John, Professor Curtis. It's a unique privilege to be among you and to be addressing the topic of Persian poetry, the question of continuity and creativity, and to just go at the very beginning to answer the question, the very good question you raised, Nargis, is yes, continuity and creativity is a process that needs to have, in the case of Persian poetry, over 11 centuries of continuity, and each generation adding something new. So being creative over a millennium is not an easy thing. And I think there are lessons there that may well be applicable to other cultural traditions as well, although I don't know how they might unfold step by step. I would not even be able to give you a step by step account of the progression of Persian poetry, but at least we can touch the surface. We can really begin to scratch the surface and see how deep and how beautiful this tradition of continuity and creativity has been. Let me just say that in order to be continuous, a document, anything will have to be creative. In order to be creative, it needs to be continuous. No text will make sense if it has no resemblance to the past, to the past texts, whatever it is that it identifies with. On the other hand, no text can be called creative if it has nothing new to offer. So there's also this dynamic constantly occurring in Persian poetry of continuity and creativity, which is still going on and began before Rudaki. We are going to talk about those guys, but let me first tell you what we are not going to have because of the shortage of time. Uh, Missing from this presentation will be the Shahnameh. It's that amazing work. And I ask IHF and SOAS and whoever is responsible to please invite me again to talk about the Shahnameh as a masterpiece of world epics. Uh, the other thing that I've had to set aside very reluctantly is the whole 4 or 5 centuries of the dominance of Indo-Persian poetry, because between the 16th and the 19th centuries, maybe even as early as the 15th century into the 19th century, really the Persian poetry, or what we call Indo-Persian poetry, was had a glorious has a glorious history in India. This is the time when poetry was frowned upon, especially secular poetry was frowned upon in Iran because of the Safavids and the Shia domination, etc., etc. And it began to really enlighten so many other poetic traditions, literary traditions in India. That's a different story that I would love to address at some point as well. But anyway, what we are offering here is through a PowerPoint presentation of 2020 some slides, at least the sketch of a history of this continuous creativity. And I hope and I know that this can be not only a key to interpreting the significance of this, not only a key to understanding the ocean of wisdom that's thus communicated, uh, if you only know Persian language, or are if you are lucky enough to have someone translate it to you. You have to have a Goethe to do that, for example. But anyway, it is something that is really an amazing instance of what it is that makes the speakers of Persian uniquely proud. You know, there's not much of a political story to tell. There's not much of a musical history to tell. There's not much of even of architectural history to tell. But when you tell the story of poetry, it really becomes impossible not to bring all of these things, these other things, into the domain of your studies. So continuity and creativity in Persian poetry really ought to be your gateway into understanding the Persian world, uh, whether it's in Iran or elsewhere, so much better than one might have done before. So let me begin by asking Astrid, who has been so kind to agree to demonstrate the slides, to go with the next slide so I can begin my talk. Okay, imagine 1100 years ago. Imagine it's 3 centuries after the coming of Islam, the advent of Islam to the Persian world. One very obvious fact is that when Islam comes out of the Arabian Peninsula, it goes to the west through the Arabic language, it goes to the east through the Persian language. And that may well be a very little known fact of this language in conversation with Arabic, in conversation at the same time with ancient Greek and Roman and other languages, that it gives and takes. And in this case, of course, the Quran becomes a very important text because it too is a book of poetry, or at least it has poetic aspects to be explored. So one of the things that happens in this cultural region we call Khorasan, which encompasses today's Iranian Khorasan, plus much of Central Asia and all of northern Afghanistan and beyond into the Khotan or Western China, is a kind of need for a secular poetry that would explain the world. Imagine human knowledge the way it may have been 1100 years ago, and how much people are thinking about various contexts. And this one-liner, and of course it's a futile search to start looking for the oldest or the first Persian poet. We don't even know who it was, but one let's say nominee for this position would be the man who said this line, "Ahuye kuhi dar dast chegune davaza, u nadarad yar biyar chegune bovaza." Mountain deer in the plain, how would he run? He has no companion. How would he be? Now imagine the run and the be, and how the question raised by the poet becomes more and more complicated. We know that mountain deers have hooves that are adjusted for grabbing at rocks in a mountainous region. But when it's placed on in the plain, would it run or would it not? Is this the story of a deer, or is it the story of Narguess and me and millions of other exiles, people who have been who've been displaced into other areas and do not have the skills to adapt to it? What would happen to them? Do we have to think that this deer will eventually kneel and die? Doesn't have to. It all depends on the internal verb, the joie de vivre, the kind of whatever it is, the élan vital that connects you to life, to say, I have to live, I have to overcome this change of place. So it's a story of exile, and this exilic motif is built into Persian poetry from its very beginning. But it's not the only one. After this, and if you see the next style, I'll explain it to you, Rudaki comes, and you'll see a very important, or maybe even more important, observation. How should we live? And look at those two words at the very beginning, shadzi, or live joyfully. Why should we live joyfully? You have to read the whole qasida, of which this is a part, but I think these few lines give you an idea of what it is. You have to enjoy the world. The world is enigmatic. The world is not knowable entirely. So maybe you should just start not thinking too much about the past and not be concerned too much for the future. Maybe you should enjoy the moment. This is the motif that we see later in Khayyam, whom I'm not representing because he's so well known in the world, and in so many other, the dam, the breath, this very breath is the one that you should seize upon. And so this is good advice. This is good advice. Live joyfully with black-eyed beauties. Live joyfully. The world is no more than legends in the wind. You may differ from the poet. You may say it's a little more knowable to us than before. And yet, have we solved all the problems of the world? Do we know all the ways of the world? So maybe it is our lot to simply occupy ourselves with the present moment. And we'll see much of this in the generations to come, building upon this. So let's go to the next slide, and I will see. This is the first. Now we are talking about the history of Persian poetry, and because it's the history of Persian poetry, history means change. So beginning with the 12th century, or let's say about 200 years into Persian poetry, mystical ideas, mystical leanings begin to seep into this poetry. I have no time to deal with Al-Kindi, the Arab, who translated many texts from ancient Greek into Arabic. And because the Persians by now had known their Arabic, because the Quran was there and the whole jurisprudence was being formed, Islamic jurisprudence. And from there you have Farabi and you have Ghazali and many, many other philosophers. These were not poets, but they were men of ideas. And the ideas they gave us shaped this poetry. So we have one instance of this here. You may have heard about Jamshid's cup. It's some sort of a holy grail type image, a holy grail type image that into which you look and you see the word. But what if someone says, you may not see the affairs of the world by looking into that cup, by looking into the holy grail, but you may see your own heart. And the heart becomes the seat of joy and sorrow and all of that. And this is this poet, Sana'i of Ghazni, who's basically, an 11th, 12th century poet, proposes this thing of looking into your heart. And this is at least 5 centuries before Shakespeare tells us to look into our heart. So anyway, I'm not claiming a privilege for Sana'i or for the Persian language, but I'm saying these are old ideas and they have traveled from place to place. So anyway, if you look at the Holy Grail, this Holy Grail, you will see everything, because your heart is the seat of joy or sorrow. And it's looking into your heart is one of the things that affects this poetry. In fact, many mystical ideas, many Sufi ideas. Mysticism, we have Jewish mysticism, we have Christian mysticism, and we have Islamic mysticism. And Sufism is another name for Islamic mysticism. For those Persian speakers, as well as Arab speakers, who have begun to understand Islam and the logic of its sacred book, the Quran, really begin to think about how to deal with the world, how to look into your heart, and what looking into your heart tells you. And it gives the whole idea of feelings and emotions and so on and so forth. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the next historical turn in this thing. Along comes Nizami, a man, late 12th century, early 13th century, with this notion of ishq, love. And he places this at the very beginning of a story about Khosrow and Shirin. And he tells us that there's nothing that the world stands upon like ishq, like love. So loving is what he teaches us. The position of loving, the act of loving, the importance of love. When he said اگر بی عشق بودی جان عالم که بودی زنده در دوران عالم, or the world is love, the rest is guile, all is a game save the game of love. If the world's soul were devoid of love, who would live in it through the ages? Can we imagine a world without love? A world in which parents do not love their children, children do not love their parents? That must be a very horrible world. But anyway, it's this sentiment that is expressed in this poem as a preamble to a story that in itself is a story of love. We know yeah, and for those of you who have not read this, you should read an English translation. There are many English translations of Khosrow and Shirin, and how this love affair between the Iranian king and the Armenian princess takes shape, and how it directs all of their affairs through their lives. So again, if we go to the next syllable, we see the next stage of this complication. The poetry gets complicated, more and more complicated. The same poetry that with Rudaki and others could only address the patron, now comes to include God. And this is in no little part thanks to the Persian language, because in Persian you do not have genders registered in the pronouns. And so what you have here is you do not have a he or a she and it. All three of them are the same. So here, one of the things that mysticism does to Persian poetry and in Persian poetry and through Persian poetry is this ability to address God. Sudden resurrection, boundless bliss, bonfire in the thicket of our thoughts, smiling you've arrived today like God's bountiful grace upon the lowly and in the soul, opening our prison gates. You are the swelling in our chests, ornament to our minds. You ask after our desires and grant them too. O unique soul giver, joy of knowing and doing, the love with no pretext and no fraud, both the illness and the cure. Look upon our intoxicated intellects, read our sweet stories, and see all this babble after daily portions of bread and victuals. Silence, poet, fly along with me, straight to the banner, put down the paper, break your pen. Cupbearer is here, salute. So the cupbearer or Sagi becomes a kind of middle person between humans and the divine. Isn't this an amazing thing? This is the height of mysticism. And this ghazal by Rumi, who is a 13th century poet, really is the apex of integration of Sufism, this notion that God can be addressed. You see this in John Donne later on in English poetry, in 17th century metaphysical poets. And you see this dialogue of one with God, God as an implicit listener to your pleas and granter of your wishes, and so on and so forth. Now, historically, of course, this line from Sanai that we quoted to Rumi that we now have, and with Attar in the middle, whom unfortunately I did not have time to deal with, was well known. Why? Because Rumi himself said it. عطار روح بود و سنایی دو چشم او ما از پی سنایی عطار آمدیم. There is, I contend, another line that keeps its base in society. And that line also begins with Sanai, but goes not through Attar, but through Nizami, and not to Rumi, but to Saadi. So whether you see this line that goes up into the metaphysics, or you see Sufism of the kind that still feels its feet on the ground, and what has to do with ideals of let's say rules, ruling and rulers and so on and so forth, you see all different kinds of mysticisms. So what you have here is Sanai, Nizami, and Saadi. With Nizami, of course, the ideal becomes Adalat, justice. And with Saadi, the ideal becomes khidmat, or service. So imagine these two ideals. In each society you pursue these. Justice given by the rulers, because they are the powerful, and service given by the people, because they can enable the rulers to be good rulers. And so whatever you have when Sufism or Islamic mysticism comes into Persian poetry, the domain grows up, becomes vaster and vaster with every generation. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the next way. And here's a very important ghazal by Hafiz, who is really considered basically the apex of the Persian ghazal, about the day of Alast. Now, this day of Alast is a very important day. It's the day, the covenant of Alast is very well known in Islam, and it is the day of creation. It's the day when God made a lump of clay into which everybody, including Adam and Eve and you and me and all the people of the future, were there. And he then addresses them, asking, Alastu barabbikum, am I not your Lord? And they say, yes, you are. And with that, a sort of marriage, a sort of coming together of man and God takes shape. I have written about this poem of Hafiz's, so let me read for a moment from this ghazal. I say, in this ghazal, the narrative and the lyric stands of the Persian poetic tradition are mobilized to make the day of creation, Azal, by definition, an inaugurating moment in the history of human life and of the emergence of ideas about the human condition. The high dramatic actions crammed into the poem may seem chaotic, but follow a divinely ordained design. And I want you to identify, if you can, the personages of this ghazal, and then see how one leads to the other and what story that in itself tells, this hierarchy of personages. So Hafiz is not only the apex of the Persian ghazal, but he's the apex of the Persian ghazal because now all of mysticism, all of Sufism can be expressed in the language of Persian poetry without the poet even being himself a mystic. So it seeps through all of the poetry, so that you can claim to be a mystic, you can claim to be a Sufi without really being it. And Hafiz has a lot of problems with that, of course. If we go to the slides that follow, of course, we'll see that as well, and how it happens in so many things. This is the same ghazal in Persian, در ازل پرتو حسرت ز تجلی دم زد عشق پیدا شد و آتش به همه عالم زد, and it goes on and on. So this is the Persian. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the next English. Now, at this point, this is the point where I'm unfortunately, I've had to delete Indo-Persian poetry. But what I recommend is that you look into poets like Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, Bidil of Delhi, and Ghalib and Delhi, and Iqbal, early 20th century. At least those four poets, but many others as well in India, even when themselves are Hindus and not Muslims at all, write Sufi poetry. And we know that Akbar, of course, dreamed about Aina Akbari, and how he wanted to bring together ancient Hindu ideas as well as Islamic mysticism. He did not quite succeed, but of course he did his best. But here's when we begin to see the beginning of modernity in Persian poetry. In the 19th century, a bunch of people appear who attack the tradition of Persian poetry on the basis that poetry is what the Europeans are writing now. It's not that they do not value the poetry of the past, but they want it modernized. And then thus the process of modernization begins to appear. Here I have a line by Sadi of Shiraz, where he says, ای مرغ سحر عشق ز پروانه بیاموز کان سوخته را جان شده آواز نیامد این مدعیان در طلبش بیخبرانند کان را که خبر شد خبری باز نیامد. Bird of the dawn, learn lessons of love from the moth, for it burned and issued no voice. These pretenders know nothing of the search for him. Those who received the news were committed to silence. Imagine silence. Imagine silence after speech. Imagine silence following speech. Imagine silence as the ocean where speech is located. And so where Sadi is addressing Morgh Sahar, which means the nightingale, this whole discourse opens up in the midst of a mystical conversation. What is silence? What's speech? What constitutes these? And which is more highly valued. But then in modern times, Iran, that's the center of the Persian language, has appeared as a country. And of course, the idea of one country, one language has appeared from Europe into this Persian and Arabic world. And there you see that Morgh Sahar is asked to do something else. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that one. So here we have a Morgh Sahar, the same kind of address, a Morgh Sahar, bird of the dawn, asking something of the bird of the dawn. But what's being asked here? This is 2 years into the Muhammad Ali Shah's despotism. He negated the constitutional revolution, and then of course the Iranians rose up he had to flee to Russia, later the Soviet Union. But at the same time, this is Morgh Sahar is said to remember all those who gave their lives in the cause of the constitutional, in the cause of constitutionalism. Bird of the dawn, when this dark night has put aside its black deeds, and at the life-giving breath of the dawn, slumber has departed from the heads of sleepers, and when the beloved of the indigo throne, that means the sun, has loosened knots from her golden tresses, God, in his perfection, has become manifest, and the evil-minded Ahriman has withdrawn to its citadel. Remember the dead candle, remember. And the dead candle is supposed to symbolize Mirza Jahangir Khan Shirazi, who was a newspaper holder, the holder of a very important political newspaper, and he had been executed by the forces of Muhammad Ali Shah. So the poem becomes completely political. And that's one way that poetry becomes modern. Now it has to do with new emerging conditions of Iran as a country, not Persian as a language that is spoken all over the place with a whole lot of ethnicities, but basically as the language of Iran, which of course today, also is also spoken in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, but the old Persianate world of the past is gone. And so we will see in the next poem how else, all the ways in which this poetry is being modernized. Now here we have what's often a beginning for Hafiz as well. سحر ز هاتف غیبم رسید مژده به گوش که دور شجاع است می دلیر بنوش. Compared to what Arif, a poet of the constitutional period, talks about, and that's پیام دوشم از پیر می فروش آمد بنوش باده که یک ملتی به هوش آمد. The fact that a whole nation comes to itself, gains its consciousness, creates an absolutely new condition which demands new poetry and new kinds of poets. So if we see this in slide after slide, if we see this, the next slides. Okay, now, one man who is oftentimes credited with this whole process of modernity, and which I contend did not begin the process of modernization, but gave it endurance at the apex of its coming, is Nima Yushij. He was a man of Mazandaran, and he himself was not that highly educated, but he had a very good political sense, and he's describing a river here. And the idea is, you look at a river, you don't see the destination of a river, but a river knows its own destination. And this then becomes a theme which other poets, as we'll see in the next slide, will take on and address in so many ways. So this is the end, the remainder of the poem. If we go to the next slide, we'll see all the other things, other ways of modernizing Persian poetry. There was this man, Hamidi Shirazi, who was a poet in the ancient tradition, and there was a lot of opposition, of course, to modernizing Persian poetry, and he talks himself as Ghuye Ziba, a beautiful swan. And of course, swans abound in Persian poetry as well as in English poetry and French poetry. But then there comes this other poet, Shamlu, who says, I am a غول زیبا. من آن غول زیبایم که در استوای شب ایستاده است. And when you see that kind of declaration of being a غول زیبا, this is a completely new image. We have not had a beautiful giant. We have not. We just have not. And now this appears here for the first time. So through a combination of new entities, as well as redefining old existing entities, this poetry modernizes itself, as we'll see in the slides that will follow. Okay, the question of a blow ball. Narguess and I know what a blow ball is. There's a belief, especially among children, that when a blow ball, which is really a kind of a very light kind of thing driven by the wind, comes your way, you interpret it as someone having a message for you, and you hold it to your ears and you speak to it. In other words, poetic behavior. And here the poet says, why are you coming to me? In my heart, all are blind, all deaf. Leave this man, a stranger in his homeland alone. A messenger of many experiences, all bitter, tells me that you are a lie, that you are a mere illusion. So here's someone who, in spite of his pen name of Omid, Akhavan Salis, calls himself Nim Nomid. So half hoping, half despairing. And he's interpreting this, trying to interpret this blow ball, and wonders how it can, what kind of message it might have. And again, there are other ways of modernizing this poetry, as we'll see in the next slide. Okay, here again, we go to a river, and this is by Abbas Kiarostami, who is a filmmaker, as you know, probably the most significant filmmaker Iran has ever had. He passed away in 2016, and he says, هیچ کس نمیداند جویبار کوچکی که جاری می شود از دل چشمه خرد قصد دریا دارد. Nobody knows that this little stream has a will to reach the ocean. Nobody knows that the little stream gushing forth from the heart of a small fountain is headed for the sea. But inside, the stream itself knows it. And so there's also this carryover from old mystical ideas, that there are things that we should not think that all the things in nature are dead. They are alive. They exhibit human qualities. So let's go to the next slide as we are approaching towards the end of this. I decided to end this with two ghazals, and of course then I couldn't resist to introducing Furugh Farrokhzad. We'll see three more slides, and here I want to show you how a whole discourse changes. So we have this 19th century poet called Baqir Khosravi. He is a grandson of Fath Ali Shah, early 19th century poet, and he is writing this ghazal in which the discourse still is embedded in the mystical, in old mystical form. Whether wells lie on my path to you, or gallows, or both, whether I may lose my head or my turban, or both, my tongue speaks of the beloved, my soul seeks the beloved, call me what you wish, intoxicated or insane, or both. And you can, of course, have this PowerPoint presentation and read the rest of it. But by the time we go to the next ghazal, it appears in the same, this is the Persian of the same ghazal. So we'll go to, okay, so we do not have Lahuti, but 30 years ago, 30 years after Khosravi, Lahuti comes and he writes another ghazal in exactly the same rhyme, the same meter, which makes it the tazmin, and carries on. What he says is this: Vatan virane az yar ast, ya aghyar, ya har do, musibat az musalman hast, ya kuffar, ya har do. And so he kind of moves, it's like almost like going from a small apartment into the main square of the city or the village, and there witnessing something. Poetry becomes public. Poetry is no longer speaks of a secret or personal love. Poetry now speaks of common concerns, our common problems and common efforts, and so on and so forth. And the reason why I want to end with Farrokhzad, of course, is obvious. She, in a lamentably short life of 32 years only, she gave us poetry that was very different from one particular point of view, and that is the point of view of a female poet. Not that we have not had female poets, we have had many of them in the past, but they too have replicated and repeated the discourse of the male poets, Saadi and Hafiz and others. But this woman, who wrote poetry only for 16 years, really talks about coming after after death, and comes and talks about it in a beautiful way that really means love is coming back. Let me read the poem and end my presentation with that. I will greet the sun again, I will greet the sun again, and the little river that once ran in me, and the clouds that were my ruminations, and the aching blossoms of poplar trees, my companions in those seasons of drought. I will greet the crowd of crows again, who brought me their rich perfumes, gifts from gardens of the night, and my mother who lived in the mirror and whose shape was the shape of my old age. I will greet the earth again, who in her lust to create me again fills her fiery belly with seeds of green. I'm coming, I'm coming, I will come again, with my long hair dripping the scent of dirt, with my eyes inflecting the density of darkness, with, with brambles I've picked from the far side of the wall. I'm coming, I'm coming, I will come again. And the doorway once more will be filled with love. And I'll greet the lovers standing in the doorway, and the little girl there still standing in love. That's herself. Anyway, so to conclude this, and to also once again reiterate the omissions I have had to make, is first of all, we have not talked about the Shahnameh, and we have not talked about Indo-Persian poetry, but we have touched at least the surface of some historical reasons why this poetry is so important to know, and why poetry is so much in the soul of Iranians. It's not a mystery, it's something to wonder at, but there are reasons behind it that we know. And of course, I have I have many thanks to make to IHF, to my good old friend in London, Hamid Sabi, and to others who have made this possible. And I will yield to Narguess Aziz. Thank you very much.
Amazing, Ahmad John, Professor Karimi-Hakkak, really so much to mull over. I was thinking when you were speaking that, an hour of this conversation, even the whole day, even, a whole term is not sufficient. Really, one needs a retreat with no distraction, of somewhere with solitude and silence, as you said, to talk about these things. You touched about so many points, and I tried to do my homework prior to this, but of course, I wasn't really sure of what you would raise. But when you were talking about this continuity and creativity, I always think this, over this almost 1100 years of literary production, creation, that the poets who have battled with, struggled with, fought against this influence that they have inherited, in some ways it gives them a license to the confidence to compose. At the same time, they will always be compared to the ones before. We still think that who could better really articulate the discourse of exile that you refer to than Rumi, than Maulana, as we know him. And the fact that this poetic voice that laments separations, it's carries on, and it's modernist poets certainly have had, you know, there have been moments of evolution, there have been moments of revolution, as you referred to Nima Yushij, as to Forough Farrokhzad. And I was trying to remember moments like when, and I ought to actually interrupt myself to say that while we have this brief conversation, I hope our audience are going to take advantage of the Q&A function to please upload your questions that we can then share with Professor Karimi-Hakkak. I was saying that with Shahnameh, for example, with Ferdowsi, that some of the stories that had, and you mentioned Nizami, that how he humanizes some rather awful episodes in the Shahnameh, which are, you know, like the cartoons that can be so violent if you really pause to think about it, but we take them, you know, the story of Azadeh or Fatane, in the fact that, you know, the king is fed up with her and just knocks her off the back of his camel and tramps over her, and how Nizami then takes this and runs away with it, gives her her own horse to begin the story that in fact she is not going to be killed, and she is not going to be, and no, the monarch doesn't kill her. And then we have these homage to Ferdowsi, whether this is true, the line with, you know, in Bustan, when Sa'di has, you know, چه خوش گفت فردوسی پاکزاد که رحمت بر آن تربت پاک باد، میازار موری که دانه کش است که جان دارد و جان شیرین خوش است. For our non-Persian speaking audience, the story of the ant running rather displaced in a sack of wheat that a man has purchased and taken from one village to another, and when he opens it finds an ant that is obviously displaced. And I always think another forced exile by this. And then Sa'di adds that سیه اندرون باشد و سنگ دل که خواهد که موری شود تنگ دل. For Ferdowsi, if indeed Ferdowsi ever used this line is not in all the manuscripts that we have of the Shahnameh. It's just a matter of, this is when the three brothers, when it's Iraj, brothers Tur and Sam, and the demise of Iraj, and then when he is killed, and this, you know, so how Sa'di, every generation seems to humanize it. And then when you mentioned Nima Yushij, I thought there was what I see as revolution, whether it's been successful or not, this utter dependency of Persian speakers, particularly in Iran, that on the sense of, you know, the beloved, that it's unattainable, that it is out of reach, and therefore the suffering, the angst, the brokenheartedness, perhaps it's just part of a deal, because right from the start, he or she is never going to be in our reach. We're never going to be good enough for him. And then Nima Yushij addresses, he's really struggling with this. حافظا این چه کید و دروغ است که از زبان می و جام ساقی است، نالی از تا ابد باورم نیست که بر آن عشق بازی که باقی است، من بر آن عاشقم کو روند است. Daring to humanize, to turn this beloved into a mortal being. But I don't know how long it lasts, because I was trying, following social media recently, you know, in Iran at the moment, we bought all the Barqi, Abi, all these widespread power cuts and blistering temperatures of 40 plus centigrade, and all the pandemic and concerns about vaccinations. And what is trending on social media? A new song by Humayun Shajarian, and the lyrics, which suddenly are everywhere, in every Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, every exchange of WhatsApp between friends, that he says, در قفس خیال تو تکیه زنم به انتظار تا که تو بشکنی قفس پر بکشم به سوی تو. And it's sort of suddenly we go back, find solace in this tradition of classical compositions. So I don't know what your thoughts are. I don't know whether I've made any sense in what I was trying to squeeze into these few words. But before I turn to our audience with their questions, what are your thoughts on this revolution against, or then suddenly going back to accepting the influence and the continuity?
I think you made a number of very valid points, really, particularly when it comes to this notion of humanizing things, which you mentioned in your discussion of Nizami. Also, the point about revolution. Revolution is a kind of evolution as well. In other words, these dichotomies are there in the language for us to take apart and to see how continuity happens. Continuity is there and change is there, and the two are in a permanent dance with one another all the way to the day of judgment. And so I think what you have said clearly identifies those parts that I need to delve more. For example, the notion of what it is that Nizami does with the Shahnameh and with Fattaneh and Azadeh and all those characters, and how every poet in a successive generation stands a chance to either affirm or correct or modify the poets that have gone before him. And that's why we have this huge ocean of wisdom that comes to us not from one poet, but from many, many readers as well. So someone states an idea, and poets after that deal with it and deal with it intelligently and in ways, in search of new ways of that are relevant to their times. So I think the points you've made further clarify this dynamic of continuity and creativity in Persian poetry. Thank you very much.
No, it's sort of fancy. Well, I can dominate and monopolize you for the rest of the session, but it's my job to actually turn to our audience. We have several questions. So one question that I think baffles everyone who's not familiar with Iran, wondering why we have so many poets that, you know, we revere so much. So a question about how is it that we have had such a huge number of poets in Iran compared with other countries? Is it that Iranians are very poetic people, or the Persian language is a very poetic language?
Well, my answer is ask Americans why they do not have enough poets, why they have so many technocrats, why they have so many politicians, and so on and so forth. So yes, you're right. The social strata have been such that wisdom and intellectualism comes through poetry and comes through poetic exercises, even when you're not writing poetry, but you're writing a story or a novel or a dramatic work or whatever it is. So I think this question really, there's no basis for it. We have to go around the world and ask, let's say, at least the major civilization building cultures, including Persian and English and so on and so forth, to find out if there are more poets now than before, or more poets in one culture than the other, or more attention is based towards poeticity and towards literature as a way of actually carrying within it the core of the nation, the core ideas of a nation. So when Americans say America is the only country that's based on an idea, they may be right, but they're not right in making it exclusive. There are many, many civilizations that are based on ideas, although yes, there are civilizations that are based on ethnicity and so on and so forth, but the world is traveling towards one race, and that is the human race. Not this or that race, not this or that skin color, not this or that let's say idiom of speech or whatever, but one understanding of the uniqueness in human beings everywhere.
That's right. Yes, I always think that what is very interesting is that our continuous familiarity with and reliance on 1100 years of poetry and these poets. I think many nations have equal number of poets, and my colleagues working on Somali poetry always challenge me that they in fact hold the #1 a place in the number of poets. And when you think there is a comment, I remember it came up with all the African American activists and references to James Baldwin, who was a writer, artist. I think he lived in 1920s in United States, and he said something that almost at the same time Sohrab Sepehri says in Iran. And Sohrab Sepehri, when he said شاعران وارث آب و خرد و روشنی and the poets are inheritors of water and light and enlightenment and wisdom. And he said, I think that the poets are finally the only people who know the truth about us. When something awful is happening into a civilization, when it ceases to produce poets, and what is even more crucial, when it ceases in any way whatever to believe in the report that only the poets can make. So it's definitely the place of poetry. Another question from Jane Lewison, and that earlier poet was from Mr. Dariush Borbor. And Jane asks that, could you say a few words about Bahar, whose poems have become some of the most beloved songs, lyrics of songs, I imagine.
But one point about what poets have said, Ezra Pound says poets are purifiers of the language of the tribe. That's a very important function of poetry. It really leaves the language more pure than before. Not pure in the sense of not borrowing from other traditions, but pure in the sense of pointing to in the same way. I know Mr. Borbor too. He's a very good friend of mine, and I'm grateful for his question. But to go to this notion of what it is that poets really do and accomplish, right? Is that the question?
Yes, it was that why do we have such a large number of poets in Persia? Is it because Persian is such a poetic language, or or is it Iranians are programmed to love poetry?
No, I believe in neither. I think Persian is a very poetic language, but I think all cultures arrive at a point when they think other endeavors stop, and one would have to think of the human condition. And when you think that way, poetry emerges as one of the basic things. And I think I lament the fact that Americans do not really appreciate poetry as much as I think they should. Even though in every generation we have had poets who have guarded the language, who have purified the language of the tribe, as Pound would say, and so on and so forth. But I think the wisdom that's invested in Persian poetry, and at times, right now, it seems as though the American culture is close to Middle Eastern cultures. It's very much open to Latin American cultures, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But it does not think, erroneously, I think, it does not think that it can learn anything from Middle Eastern cultures. I think there comes a time when the system of American culture will open up to these things. I hope it's not too late. And there was a time in the 19th century when the transcendentalists, American transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne and those guys really appreciated Persian poets. And before them, of course, Goethe in Germany. So there are people who are inclined to appreciate the language that poetry assumes in order to communicate with others, with speakers of other languages. But, at the same time, whether it's immediate or occasional, cultures have to remain in contact and always appreciate. It's not to say one culture is better than others, but it is to say that, yes, the Persian language is particularly armed with, if you will, armed may not be equipped with this notion of poetry as a way to salvation, to human salvation.
Yes. And in response to Jane, with regards to poetry of Jane Lewis and poetry of Bahar, You know, why have they become such beloved Persian
Bahar
poets?
lived at the right time for a poet, the poet that he was. He was, on the one hand, a poet that wanted to speak about the country and that he had a country to speak about. Uh, a poet like Sanai or Hafiz couldn't have said, "Ey div sepid pay dar band, ey gomadegiti ey damavand." It's Bahar who sees that damavand, that mountaintop, and is amazed by its power and is thinking why damavand will not erupt in order to do something about Tehran, or Rey as he calls it. So he is a poet that was born at the right time, and he was appreciated, and he also was a firm believer in this idea of continuity and creativity. He faced contemporaries such as, for example, Mirzade Eshqi, and such as Rafat and others, who thought that a revolution is in order. But a revolution, if it turns up everything, if it turns away from all of its past, cannot succeed. It's this course of continuity and creativity, as well as his immense talent, that made him such an important poet.
That's right. And possibly maybe the metrical language of a characteristic that somehow fits with the music so much. We have a question from Dhaka, from Rumi Saifullah, who says that how do you see the semblances between the humanizing aspects back in the days of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, Hafiz Sa'di, as compared to the modern Persian poets and authors of today? And also, has the ideological or romanticism in Persian, in Farsi, has it gone through changes in the last few centuries?
Sure, there's nothing that does not go through changes. It's the question is whether those changes are perceptible enough to be seen by the human eye, or weighed by the human mind. So change is a constant. It is the degree of change that makes it visible or makes it invisible. But onto back this humanization or otherwise mobilizing, poetry can go either way. Let's remember that Hitler too had poets, and there was horrible poetry written there based on the fact that there are different races and so on, and one race is superior over others. Just like you have in America, you had it in Germany, let's say 80 years ago or 90 years ago. So there are these forces that try to express themselves through poetry. It's for readers, that contemporary and in future generations, that accept them as poetry. We have selected Rumi to become our chief Sufi poet, and we have selected rightly. And we have selected Ferdowsi to tell the stories of old Iran, and he has done a wonderful job. So it is partly how the people of the speakers of the language respect poets of the past. We know, as you well know, Narguess John, we have had many manuscripts that have disappeared, and no one laments them. And there are very few manuscripts that have disappeared, and we lament them because we think that if we had them, they would have added to that wisdom. So I think in this case, it's not a question of the poet himself or herself, but it's how the future judges that poet.
That's true. It's very interesting you say that. Talking to some, Tajik friends or Afghan friends, and this idea that, for them, Bidel is so important. Amir Khosrow, and it's actually, they are not part of, discourse of Iranians so much. I don't know any of our young Iranians who would be able to recite a Bidel poem or Amir Khosrow, but while they do in other Persian-speaking words. And it's so true that you say that we also select. A question from David Chaffetz: how much does the conservatism of the literary language contribute to the continuity of poetry? What would happen if Iranians began to write only colloquial language?
I don't know what conservatism of the literary language might mean. I think maybe the questioner should question that first. and find a response to his own question or her own question. The literary language is literary. It's not conservative. Can we say, for example, that Ernest Hemingway was conservative, or was he forward-looking and progressive? It's a tough question to respond, because we don't know. I do not agree that by nature the literary language is more conservative than let's say colloquial language. It is true that we have had a few colloquial users of colloquial language in poetry, but we have had a tremendous number of people who have had to adopt the poetry of Ferdowsi and Saadi and Hafiz in order to write poetry, to be seen as poetry. It's not whether it's conservative or progressive, it's whether it's poetic or not poetic.
That's right. And we know Ahmad Shamlu has been very successful in sort of incorporating the colloquialism in a particular genre of his poetry. I had a question. Of course, I'm very conscious, Astrid's probably going to mute us, that we have gone over time, but I think I might be allowed to stretch this conversation for another 5 or so minutes. And I see that David Chaffetz, who asked this question, has written back saying, can for example, you know, reading Beowulf, the English epic of I believe sort of 7th to 8th century, there is a difference between Persian and English. Obviously, the fact that we can read 1100-year-old poems, like you showed with Rudaki and before that. So
you know, Iranians oftentimes say we can read. I know you can read, and I know I can read, but not every Iranian can read ancient poetry or poetry 1100 years ago or 1000 years ago. But the point about Beowulf is interesting, because that work resembles the Shahnameh so much, and it's a question of man fighting dragons. And so whether it's Beowulf or let's say the Consolazione Filosofica, there are always readings of the past. Readings of the past fall into 2 major categories. Either they treat the mythologies of the past, that's one strain, and the other one is ideas of the past, basic ideas of the past. The Consolazione de Filosofia has its parallel in Persian, not in Persian, but written by a Persian in the Arabic language, Tahafat al-Falasife. And I did not mention, I did mention, I think, Al-Kindi, Farabi, and Ghazali.
Yes, you did.
But the role that these guys played in really observing culture go through Arabic into ancient Greece, ancient Greek, and reach some sort of, let's say, a drop of surviving human ideas is very important. I'm not sure. I think perhaps the British have not minded their past as much as they could have. What they have minded is good, and we all are very much enriched by Shakespeare and Milton and Wordsworth and so on and so forth. But you know, I wonder if as much energy has been given to English poetry by the British as has been given by the Persians to Persian poetry.
That's right. Yeah, I think I probably need to begin to wrap up, but I can't not select a question by one of our wonderful students at SOAS, our postgraduate student, Simin Amini, who says thank you very much, Professor Karimi-Hakkak. Can we state that that Persian poetry has a lot more abstract and spiritual concepts rather than materialistic or worldly notions, say, compared to Western literature?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. It's enough to just look at Saadi, one of those counselors, one of those people who dispense advice, to see how much نامنیکی گر بماند زاده به کدو ماند سرای زرنگار. He constantly undermines material wealth, material inheritance, and goes for the question of nominee, for the question of the man who is remembered well, who is remembered as a good man, as one who has served. So yes, there's wisdom in everything that we read. There's more in some poets than in others, you know. And there are poets who just tell you the story and let you decide on the wisdom of it. Ferdowsi is one such poet. He does not oftentimes interfere in the texture of his narrative, but we know where he stands when he says "Be nam Khudavand jan u khirad," and begins with that khirad, which is very different, by the way, from aql as it appears in the mystical discourse. But we do not have time to discuss. But I appreciate Simin's question, and I think it's a question that she should follow to its logical conclusion.
Absolutely. Well, I am very conscious that we have overstayed our allotted hour, but I could easily go on for many, many more hours. And it is amazing. It's fantastic that on this occasion of the epic Iran exhibition, the Iran Shokuhmand Hemasei be Name Iran, which has been a phenomenally well-received exhibition in London. And I very much hope, Professor Hakkak, that you will be able to come to London, I don't know, before the end of September. Let's keep our fingers crossed. And I very much hope that we can entice you back to our either online platform, but much more, I hope, back to our universities in UK, to have you back as our mehman واقعا عزیز و نور چشم. And I always think of a poem, a line out of Feridun Tavallali, talk about poets who fall out of fashion. And I remember a line when the energy that you bring to your scholarship, to your presentations, the way you challenge your students, whether they are esteemed colleagues or just young discovering Persian poetry for the first time. He has this line that he says, هزاران واژه در پیشم به کرنش سرفرو دارد. خدیواسا چو برخیزد خروش طبع بیباکم. I'll translate that for another time, but the fact that thousands of expressions stare in me once my majestic talent, poetic inspiration wakes up again. And I always admire your amazing enthusiasm. Your scholarship is beyond compare, and it will never be challenged or criticized, but your energy that you've brought to Persian studies in the United States, still keeping our colleagues in Iran, students all over the world enthused, and culture is indebted to your literary and your scholarship, the output of your academic writing. I thank you very much on behalf of, first and foremost, myself, on behalf of Iran Heritage Foundation, on the Epic Iran exhibition, all the colleagues here. I don't know whether John would like to have the final word or not, but as far as I'm concerned, this is به امید دیدار هر چه زودتر, and we wish you very well for this mega project that you are working on, the literary history of Iran. So یک دنیا سپاس. Wonderful. John, I don't know whether you'd like to, or Astrid would like to say anything, or you're happy for me to say Khuda Nigahdar on behalf of all our audience who have stayed the course, and we're grateful for their attendance. John is here.
Thank you so much, Narguess and Ahmad, for a wonderful evening. And I'm sure everybody all around the world has enjoyed it enormously. And we must hopefully organize another event of this kind. Thank you so much. We're very, very grateful to you both.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Narguess Jan. And thank
خدا
you.
نگهدارتون. به امید دیدار احمد جان. خداحافظ.